The first time I heard her voice, I almost kept walking. If I had, I would have missed the quietest moment that ended up changing two lives forever. She stood halfway up the old wooden staircase of Ashcombe Library, one hand resting lightly on the polished railing as though she wasn't certain whether to climb higher or come back down. The afternoon sunlight slipped through the tall windows, stretching golden rectangles across the floor. She looked toward me with an expression that was equal parts hope and hesitation before lowering her eyes. "If you turn around," she whispered, "I'll pretend I didn't see you." The words were so unexpected that I froze. Most people would have asked why, some would have laughed nervously, others might have walked away to avoid an awkward conversation with a stranger. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. "I don't think I want to pretend," I answered gently. She smiled, but only for a second. It was the kind of smile that appeared like sunlight behind clouds before disappearing again. "I thought you might say that." That was the beginning. Looking back now, I realize life doesn't always announce its biggest moments with applause. Sometimes they arrive disguised as ordinary afternoons, old staircases, and whispered sentences from people carrying stories too heavy to say aloud. My name is Nathan Ellery, and until that day, I believed I understood loneliness. I was wrong. I had moved to the quiet village of Brindle Heath nearly 8 months earlier after leaving a demanding job in London. My friends assumed I'd become tired of city life, and in many ways they were right. Endless meetings, crowded trains, and constant deadlines had gradually replaced every hobby I'd once loved. But there was another reason I never mentioned. After my father passed away, I inherited his small cottage on the edge of the village. Every room reminded me of someone who had always found time for others, even when life had been difficult. Dad had repaired bicycles for children without charging a penny. He had visited neighbors who lived alone. He remembered birthdays, anniversaries, favorite football clubs, and even which flowers people liked growing outside their windows. I inherited his cottage. I wasn't sure I'd inherited his heart. The first few months were quiet. Every morning I walked to Ashcombe Library, where I volunteered 3 days each week. The library wasn't large, but it was loved. Shelves of worn novels stood beside local history books. Comfortable chairs faced wide windows overlooking a tiny public garden where elderly couples often sat feeding birds. There was something peaceful about the place. People lowered their voices without being asked. Children laughed softly. Even silence seemed welcome. The stairs where I'd first seen her connected the main reading room to a small upper gallery filled with donated books. Few visitors bothered climbing them, except her. I'd noticed her before that afternoon. She usually arrived around 3 o'clock carrying a canvas satchel that looked older than she was. She always borrowed books about painting, architecture, or poetry, though I never saw her reading for very long. Instead, she spent most of her visits staring through the upstairs window, not sadly, thoughtfully, as though she were searching for something just beyond the village rooftops. Her name, I later discovered, was Harriet Rowe. She was 32. She lived alone in a converted cottage across the village green, and despite visiting twice each week, she barely spoken to anyone since moving to Brindle Heath almost a year before. At least, that's what Mrs. Parker told me. Mrs. Parker knew everyone. Officially she managed the library, unofficially she managed the village. "If Harriet ever starts talking," Mrs. Parker said while stamping returned books one afternoon, "listen more than you speak." Why? Because quiet people usually spend a long time deciding whom to trust. Those words stayed with me. Standing near the staircase, Harriet glanced toward the upstairs gallery before returning her attention to me. "I've been trying to decide something for weeks," she admitted. "Would you like help?" She laughed softly. I don't even know the question properly. There was something honest about that answer. Most adults pretended certainty. She didn't. "I'm Nathan," I said. "I know, you do. You shelf books in alphabetical order even when nobody asks you to." I blinked. "You've noticed?" "You straightened the chairs before closing." I smiled, guilty. "And every Friday," she continued, "you'll leave fresh flowers beside the history section." I hadn't expected anyone to notice that either. The flowers were for Mrs. Parker. She never asked for them. She simply smiled every Friday morning before pretending she had no idea where they'd come from. I suppose I'm easier to observe than I realized. Harriet nodded. You're kind when nobody is watching. I didn't know what to say. Compliments usually embarrassed me, especially unexpected ones. So, I finally replied, what have you noticed about yourself? She looked toward the window again. That I've become very good at disappearing. Those words settled quietly between us. Not dramatic, not desperate, simply true. I don't think you've disappeared, I said after a moment. You found me, maybe because you were waiting to be found. She looked genuinely surprised. No one's ever said that. Before either of us could continue, Mrs. Parker called from downstairs. Nathan, those donated boxes won't unpack themselves. I looked apologetically toward Harriet. Duty calls. She nodded. I know. As I turned to leave, she spoke again. Thank you. For what? For not turning around. That evening I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. Not because it had been extraordinary, because it hadn't. There were no dramatic confessions, no impossible coincidences, just two strangers exchanging honesty in a world that often rewarded pretending everything was fine. The following Tuesday she returned. This time she walked directly to the reception desk. Do you have any books about restoring old paintings? Mrs. Parker smiled knowingly. Nathan, I looked up from arranging donated novels. I think someone has a question only you can answer. I doubt that. Harriet smiled slightly. I heard you studied art before changing careers. I raised an eyebrow. The village really does know everything. Mrs. Parker grinned. Eventually, we spent the next hour searching through shelves together. She wasn't actually restoring paintings. She simply liked understanding how damaged things could become beautiful again. That's an unusual interest, I remarked. So is repairing old books, she replied. Touché. Eventually we found 3 titles hidden among oversized reference books. She held one carefully. I like things that survive. So do I. Neither of us explained what we meant. We didn't need to. Over the following weeks, our conversations became a quiet routine. Every Tuesday, every Friday, sometimes only 5 minutes, sometimes nearly an hour, we discussed books, village traditions, forgotten artists, favorite childhood stories, and whether old buildings somehow remembered the people who'd once lived inside them. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened completely. She never interrupted. One afternoon I discovered she sketched the library whenever she thought nobody was looking. Tiny pencil drawings filled a worn notebook, the staircase, the reading chairs, Mrs. Parker watering plants, and elderly gentlemen asleep beside the fireplace. Even me, balancing 3 stacks of books while trying not to drop them. They're remarkable, I said honestly. She closed the notebook immediately. They're unfinished. They're beautiful. They're only practice. I remembered something my father used to tell nervous children learning to ride bicycles. Practice deserves encouragement too. She looked down at the notebook again. No one's seen these. I'm honored. She hesitated before handing it back. Promise you won't laugh? I couldn't if I tried. She believed me. That mattered more than I realized. As summer slowly settled over Brindle Heath, the village prepared for its annual community fair. Everyone contributed something. Garden competitions, homemade cakes, choirs, craft stalls, charity auctions. Mrs. Parker announced that the library would host an exhibition celebrating local creativity. We need photographs, poems, paintings, woodworking. Anything made with care. People immediately volunteered. Harriet quietly stepped backwards. I noticed. After the meeting ended, I caught up with her outside. You should display your sketches. She shook her head instantly. Why not? They're not good enough. They're excellent. They're private. I considered arguing. Instead I asked, have you always believed that? She frowned. Believed what? That something has to be perfect before it deserves to be seen. She didn't answer. Sometimes silence says yes more clearly than words ever can. I used to think that too, I admitted. What changed? My father. She waited. He once built a birdhouse with a crooked roof. She laughed. Crooked? Very. Did the birds mind? Not at all. What did your father say? I smiled at the memory. He said, love doesn't measure with rulers. Harriet repeated the sentence almost to herself. Love doesn't measure with rulers. We walked in comfortable silence toward the village green. Children chased each other around the fountain while neighbors arranged flower baskets outside nearby shops. Life continued with its ordinary rhythm. Then Harriet spoke quietly. I used to exhibit my artwork. You did? In another town. What happened? She looked across the green before answering. I forgot why I started creating. The answer puzzled me. Were people unkind? So what changed? I began painting to impress people instead of connecting with them. She smiled sadly. When every picture became a performance, I stopped recognizing myself. That evening I thought about her words for a long time. How many people quietly abandoned the things they loved because they became too concerned with approval? Perhaps more than we realized. The next Friday, I arrived at the library earlier than usual. Someone had left a small wrapped parcel on the front desk with my name written in careful handwriting. Inside was a bookmark. It had been painted by hand. A staircase climbed gently toward an open window where sunlight spilled across the pages of an unfinished book. On the back were just 700 words. Thank you for never asking me to hurry. I looked around instinctively. She wasn't there. Mrs. Parker smiled from across the room. Some gifts, she said softly, aren't meant to answer questions. I slipped the bookmark inside the novel I was reading and smiled to myself. For the first time in a long while, Ashcombe Library didn't simply feel like a place where stories were kept. It had quietly become the place where a new one was beginning, built not on grand promises or dramatic moments, but on patience, kindness, and two people slowly discovering that sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is stop pretending they don't want to be seen. The bookmark remained inside my novel for weeks, though I rarely opened that particular page without pausing for a moment. Every time I saw the painted staircase leading toward the bright window, I remembered Harriet's whisper on the afternoon we'd first spoken. If you turn around, I'll pretend I didn't see you. At first, I'd thought those words were about shyness. Now I understood they were about fear, not the fear of strangers, the fear of being known. There is a difference. One Tuesday afternoon, the library was quieter than usual. Schools had already broken for the summer holiday, and most families were enjoying the warm weather in the village park. Mrs. Parker disappeared into the storage room to organize donated books, leaving me to sort returns. Harriet arrived carrying the same canvas satchel, though this time there was something else tucked carefully beneath her arm, a flat leather folder. She hesitated near the entrance before walking toward me. I've brought something. I can see that. I'm already thinking about taking it home again. I smiled. Would you like to change your mind before or after we have tea? She laughed. Tea first. The library kept a small kitchen tucked behind the reading room, where volunteers escaped for 10 quiet minutes whenever the day allowed. We carried 2 mugs into the tiny courtyard behind the building, where climbing roses had wrapped themselves around an old stone wall. For several minutes we simply watched bees drift lazily between the flowers. Eventually Harriet placed the leather folder on the table. I've been painting again. That's wonderful. I didn't say they were wonderful. No, I replied. You said you were painting again. That's the wonderful part. She looked at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize. It was the look people wore when someone had answered a question they hadn't asked aloud. Carefully she opened the folder. Inside were 6 watercolor paintings. Not grand landscapes, not dramatic portraits. Simple moments. Mrs. Parker placing fresh flowers into a vase, an elderly couple holding hands while reading newspapers, the village baker handing a loaf of bread to a laughing child, the library staircase glowing in afternoon sunlight, a robin perched outside the upstairs window, and finally, a man kneeling beside a shelf, carefully repairing the torn spine of an old book. Me, I stared at the painting for several seconds before finding my voice. You remembered my jumper. She blinked. That's what you noticed. The navy one with the elbow patches. It was your father's, wasn't it? I looked at her, surprised. How did you know? You always smooth the sleeves before you start working. I smiled quietly. He wore it for years. It looked important. It is. She nodded, as though she'd expected that answer. You don't paint people the way they look, I said after studying the pictures again. You paint them the way they make others feel. She lowered her eyes. I've never been able to explain that. You don't need to. She looked relieved. I thought people would say they weren't realistic. They're more realistic than photographs. That afternoon something changed between us, not dramatically, just enough that silence stopped feeling uncertain. Silence became another language we both understood. Over the following weeks our friendship spread naturally beyond the library. On Saturday mornings we visited the village market together. Harriet always stopped to admire handmade pottery. I always spent too long looking through second-hand books. The market vendors soon learned our names. Mr. Wilcox, who sold vegetables from his family farm, insisted we sample whatever fruit was in season. "You can't buy strawberries without tasting one first," he declared. Harriet accepted one with a smile. "They're sweeter this year. They've had plenty of sunshine." "So have people," she answered. Mr. Wilcox laughed. "I'll remember that." Later, while carrying our shopping bags through the village square, I asked, "Do you always see everything a little differently?" She thought about it. "I notice small things, such as, when someone says they're fine but keeps twisting their wedding ring, when children wave at dogs before their owners, when lonely people sit facing doorways." I looked at her. "You notice loneliness?" She nodded. "Because I've lived with it." There was no self-pity in her voice, only honesty. I wondered how many invisible conversations she had quietly understood simply because she'd experienced similar feelings herself. One evening Mrs. Parker invited several library volunteers to dinner at her cottage. It wasn't a formal gathering, just homemade pie, laughter, and neighbors who had known one another for decades. Harriet almost declined. "I don't really know everyone." "Neither did I once," I reminded her. She hesitated. "What if I make things awkward?" "You won't." "What if I don't know what to say?" "You can ask people about themselves." "And if there's an awkward silence?" "I've heard those aren't always disasters." She smiled knowingly. "You've improved since the staircase." I had a good teacher. Mrs. Parker's cottage overlooked a meadow filled with wildflowers. Strings of tiny lights hung between old apple trees, creating a gentle golden glow as evening settled over the garden. The guests welcomed Harriet warmly. No one questioned where she'd come from, no one demanded explanations. Instead they asked ordinary questions. Did she enjoy gardening? Had she tried the bakery's cinnamon rolls? Was she planning to visit the summer concert? Simple conversations, simple kindness. By the end of the evening she was laughing with Mrs. Parker over a story involving a runaway wheelbarrow and 20 escaped pumpkins. Walking home beneath the clear night sky, she spoke quietly. "I forgot communities could feel like this." "What were you expecting? To feel like an outsider?" And instead, they made room without making me feel different. I remembered something my father often said: the kindest people don't pull someone into the circle, they make the circle bigger. Harriet smiled. "I think your father would have liked this village." I think this village would have liked him. As August approached, preparations for the community fair became impossible to ignore. Colorful banners appeared along the high street. Children practiced songs outside the church hall. The cricket club organized friendly matches. The library transformed one corner into a gallery for local artists. Mrs. Parker continued encouraging Harriet to contribute, without pressure, without guilt, just quiet confidence. "You don't owe anyone your paintings," she said one afternoon, "but if they help someone feel less alone." She left the sentence unfinished. Harriet understood. So did I. A few days later I found her sitting alone on a bench overlooking the village pond. She wasn't sketching, she was simply watching ducks drift across the water. "I've made a decision," she said before I even sat down. "Good or bad?" "I don't know yet." She handed me a folded piece of paper. Inside was the application form for the exhibition. Signed. I said yes. I couldn't help smiling. "I'm proud of you." "Don't be proud yet." "Why not?" "I still have to deliver the paintings, one step at a time." She nodded. "One step." Then she looked across the pond. "Nathan?" "Yes." "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone here?" "Of course." She took a slow breath. "I didn't move to Brindle Heath because I wanted a quieter life. I stayed silent." She continued. "I left my old town because I believed I'd failed. I waited. I spent years trying to become a successful illustrator. I earned enough money. I received praise. I even won a local award." She looked down at her hands. "But somewhere along the way I started measuring my worth by applause." "What happened when the applause stopped?" "I thought I had stopped mattering." The words hung softly in the warm afternoon air. "It's strange," she said. "No one actually rejected me, No one told me to quit. I simply became convinced that unless everything I created was extraordinary, there was no point creating anything. I understood more than she realized. My father built furniture. She looked up. He never became famous. People outside our county never knew his name. But 40 years later, families still eat dinner around tables he made. I smiled. He used to tell me something. What? You don't have to reach everyone. If your work makes one person's day lighter, you've already done enough. Harriet's eyes became thoughtful. Do you think that's really enough? I do. She looked toward the pond again. I hope I can believe that. The week before the exhibition, the library buzzed with activity. Frames arrived, labels were printed, shelves were rearranged. Children helped hang paper decorations across the reading room. Harriet finally brought her paintings. She carried them in quietly, almost apologetically. Mrs. Parker welcomed her with a smile that somehow managed to say, "I knew you could." Together we arranged 6 paintings along one wall. Nothing flashy, no oversized title, just moments of ordinary kindness captured in gentle colors. When the last frame was hung, Harriet stepped backwards. They look so small. I stood beside her. They look honest. Do you really think people will stop to look? I think they'll recognize themselves. She frowned. What if nobody notices? Before I could answer, Mrs. Parker walked over. My dear, she looked carefully at the paintings before smiling. People don't remember exhibitions because every picture was perfect, they remember because one picture quietly stayed with them on the journey home. Harriet stared at the paintings again. I hope one of mine stays with someone. Mrs. Parker gently squeezed her shoulder. I have a feeling it already has. The exhibition opened on Saturday morning. Visitors wandered slowly through the library. Some admired landscapes, others examined wood carvings or embroidered quilts. Children proudly showed parents drawings they'd contributed. Harriet stood near the back shelves pretending to organize books. She insisted she wasn't hiding. No one believed her. The first person to stop in front of her paintings was an elderly gentleman named Arthur. He spent nearly 10 minutes studying the painting of the elderly couple reading newspapers together. Eventually he turned toward Harriet. Did you paint these? She nodded. I did. My wife passed away 3 years ago. Harriet's smile softened. I'm sorry. Arthur looked back at the painting. The way you've painted their hands. That's exactly how Margaret used to hold mine. His voice trembled only slightly. I haven't thought about that in a long while. He smiled warmly. Thank you for reminding me. Harriet couldn't speak. She simply nodded. After Arthur walked away, she looked at me. Her eyes shimmered, not with sadness, but with understanding. One person, I whispered. She smiled. One person. By lunchtime several visitors had quietly shared similar stories. One young mother said the painting of the baker reminded her of her grandfather. A teenager admitted the library staircase looked like hope. Mrs. Parker wrote those exact words in the visitor's book after asking permission. Like hope. Late that afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Harriet stood once again beside the old staircase where we'd first met. Sunlight poured through the tall windows exactly as it had weeks before. She rested one hand on the polished railing. I've been thinking, she said. Dangerous habit. She laughed. It is. Then she looked directly at me. That day, when I told you I'd pretend I hadn't seen you, you know what I was really asking? I shook my head. She smiled gently. I was wondering whether anyone would think I was worth stopping for. I felt a lump rise in my throat. I never had to wonder. She looked surprised. Why? Because kindness always gives itself away. You were carrying it even when you believed you had nothing to offer. She looked toward the paintings lining the opposite wall. For the first time since I'd met her, she stood a little straighter. Not because she'd received compliments, not because people admired her work, but because she was beginning to understand that the greatest gift she possessed had never been her talent. It was her ability to help people feel seen. And once someone discovers that their quiet kindness can become another person's light, they never walk through the world in quite the same way again. Sunday morning arrived with the gentle hum of church bells drifting across Brindle Heath. The village moved at its familiar, unhurried pace. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps. Neighbors paused to exchange cheerful greetings, and children raced across the green with the kind of carefree laughter that seemed to make the whole place feel younger. The library exhibition remained open for one final day. Harriet almost suggested staying home. "I've already been there yesterday," she said while stirring sugar into her tea at the little cafe copyright opposite the post office. I smiled. "And, I don't know if I should go again." "Why?" She looked down at the table. "It feels strange standing beside paintings people are looking at." "You don't have to stand beside them. What if someone wants to speak to me?" "You can." "And if I don't know what to say?" I grinned. "Then you can say, 'Thank you.'" She laughed. "You make everything sound easier." I shook my head gently. "I just think courage often looks much smaller than we imagine." She thought about that for a moment. "Smaller?" "Sometimes courage is simply showing up twice." That seemed to settle something inside her. When we arrived at Ashcombe Library, Mrs. Parker was arranging fresh flowers in a blue ceramic vase. "I wondered how long it would take you to." "You expected us?" Harriet asked. "My dear," Mrs. Parker replied warmly, "hope has a habit of arriving exactly when it's needed." The exhibition was busier than the day before. Word had spread through nearby villages, and several visitors had traveled specifically to see the collection of local artwork. Harriet quietly wandered through the displays instead of standing near her own paintings. For the first time, she looked at everyone else's work with relaxed admiration rather than comparison. She paused beside a handmade quilt stitched by 90-year-old Edith Collins. "It's beautiful." Edith chuckled. "I nearly didn't enter it." "Really?" "I kept finding little mistakes." Harriet smiled knowingly. "What changed your mind?" Edith folded her hands. "My granddaughter said something clever." "What did she say?" "Nan, if you wait until everything's perfect, nobody gets to enjoy it." Harriet laughed softly. "She sounds wise." "She's 11, sometimes that's the perfect age for wisdom." As they continued talking, I noticed something wonderful. Harriet wasn't thinking about herself anymore. She was asking Edith about colors, memories, family traditions, and the stories stitched into each square of fabric. It struck me then that confidence rarely arrives all at once. It grows quietly every time we become more interested in encouraging someone else than protecting ourselves. Just after midday, Mrs. Parker tapped a spoon gently against a teacup. "If I may have everyone's attention." The conversations gradually faded. "We've had a wonderful weekend celebrating creativity in our village." She smiled around the room. "But I'd like to finish by thanking someone whose work reminded many of us that ordinary kindness deserves to be remembered." Harriet's eyes widened. Mrs. Parker continued before Harriet could disappear behind a bookshelf. "Several visitors have written notes in our guest book. I've asked permission to read just a few." She opened the book carefully. The first note read, "I came to look at paintings. I left thinking about my father. Thank you for helping me remember his smile." Another said, "I've lived alone for 6 years. Looking at these pictures reminded me that quiet lives still matter." A third simply read, "The staircase painting made me phone my sister after 3 months of silence." The room became very still. Mrs. Parker closed the book. "Art doesn't always change the world." She looked towards Harriet. "But sometimes it changes a single afternoon. And sometimes, a single afternoon changes a life." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It felt genuine. Harriet stood completely still. When the applause faded, she walked over to Mrs. Parker. "I don't know what to say." Mrs. Parker hugged her gently. "You've already said it." "How?" "With every brushstroke." That evening, after the exhibition closed, volunteers carefully removed paintings from the walls. Harriet wrapped each frame in brown paper. She handled them differently now, not like fragile secrets, like treasured memories. As we carried the final box towards the storage room, I noticed one painting was missing, the staircase. She looked up. "What about it?" "It's gone." Mrs. Parker smiled from across the room. "It's sold." Harriet blinked. "It? What?" "A gentleman from the neighboring village bought it, but he said he wanted to hang it beside his front door." "Why?" Mrs. Parker unfolded the receipt. "He left a note." She handed it to Harriet. The handwriting was neat. It read, "I've spent too many years rushing past people without really seeing them. Every time I leave my house, I want this painting to remind me to slow down." Harriet read it twice, then folded it carefully. "I thought people would only see a staircase." Mrs. Parker smiled. "They saw what you saw." On the walk home, neither of us spoke for several minutes. The evening sun painted long shadows across the village green. Children chased footballs. Neighbors watered gardens. Someone practiced the piano with the windows open. Life continued exactly as it always had. And yet, somehow, everything felt different. Nathan, yes, can I ask you something? Always. Why did you stop that first day? I looked at her. When you whispered on the stairs, you could have carried on walking. I smiled to myself. I almost did. She waited. Then I remembered something my father used to say. What was it? Whenever someone gives you the chance to be kind, don't hurry past it. She looked ahead quietly. He sounds like he was an extraordinary man. He'd have disagreed. Why? He believed ordinary people were capable of extraordinary kindness. She smiled. I think he was right. Summer slowly drifted towards autumn. The village settled into another season. Leaves began gathering beneath old oak trees. The mornings carried a cool freshness. The library windows glowed warmly against earlier sunsets. Life found its rhythm once again. But something had changed. Harriet began teaching a free Wednesday evening sketching group in the library. Only 4 people came to the first session. She considered it a failure. Mrs. Parker called it a beginning. By the 3rd week there were 10. By the 2nd month there were 18. Teenagers sketched beside retirees. Parents attended with grown children. People who insisted they couldn't draw at all discovered they simply hadn't been encouraged yet. Harriet never corrected anyone harshly. Instead she asked questions. What caught your eye? What feeling were you trying to capture? What story does this picture tell? Slowly people stopped worrying about perfect lines. They started noticing each other. One evening I watched an elderly widower helping a nervous university student mix watercolors. Across the room, a nurse encouraged a retired mechanic whose hands shook slightly. Nobody compared. Nobody competed. They simply created. After class, Harriet stood beside the upstairs window where she'd once spent so many silent afternoons. I've realized something. What? I thought I came here because I needed somewhere to hide. She looked down at the library below. But perhaps, I came here because I needed somewhere to belong. You've helped create that place. She smiled. I didn't do it alone. I looked around the room where laughter still echoed softly. You just went first. As Christmas approached, the library organized a display called Moments That Matter. Instead of famous quotations, visitors were invited to write about a small act of kindness that had changed their lives. Within days the notice board overflowed. Someone remembered a stranger carrying groceries. Another wrote about a teacher who stayed after school. One note simply said, "A neighbor kept watering my garden while I recovered from surgery. They never mentioned it." Another read, "A friend sat beside me without trying to fix everything." Harriet stood reading every note. So many tiny moments. They weren't tiny to the people who received them. She nodded slowly. Maybe kindness is like that. Quiet from one side, life-changing from the other. Near the bottom of the board, someone had pinned a folded card without signing their name. Harriet opened it carefully. Inside were just 2 sentences. "Thank you for painting people as though they matter. You reminded me that perhaps I do too." She closed the card and held it gently against her heart. Tears gathered in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were the quiet tears that arrive when hope finally settles somewhere it has long been searching for. On the final afternoon before Christmas, snowflakes drifted lazily across Brindle Heath, covering rooftops in a soft blanket of white. The library closed early. Mrs. Parker locked the front doors before handing each of us a small wrapped parcel. For faithful volunteers. Mine contained a leather notebook. Harriet's contained a new set of watercolor brushes. Mrs. Parker smiled. "I have one request." "Anything," Harriet answered. "Promise me you'll wear those brushes out." Harriet laughed. "I think I can manage that." We stepped outside. The village looked peaceful beneath the falling snow. As we reached the old staircase visible through the library window, Harriet stopped. "Funny." "What is?" "I spent months hiding near those stairs." "And now?" She smiled. "Now they're simply stairs." I looked at her thoughtfully. "They're more than that." "How?" "They're the place where one whispered sentence became an entirely different life." She followed my gaze through the window. "If I hadn't spoken, you did. If you hadn't stopped, I did." She laughed softly. "I suppose neither of us will ever know what would have happened otherwise. Perhaps we don't need to." She nodded. "I think you are right." Years later, visitors to Ashcombe Library would still notice a framed watercolor hanging near the entrance. It showed an old wooden staircase washed in warm afternoon light. There were no people in the painting, only a handwritten line beneath it. "If you turn around, I'll pretend I didn't see you." Beside those words, in smaller letters, someone had added another sentence: "But sometimes the kindest thing we can do is stop, turn around, and let someone know they were seen all along." People often paused to read it before continuing through the library. Some smiled. Some grew thoughtful. Some quietly telephoned an old friend on the way home. Others simply walked a little slower than they had before. Because life is rarely transformed by grand speeches or remarkable coincidences. More often, it changes through ordinary choices made with extraordinary compassion. A patient conversation, a gentle smile, a moment of listening, the courage to stay instead of walking away. And perhaps the greatest gift we can ever offer another person is not advice, applause, or perfect words. Perhaps it is the simple, unforgettable assurance that they were never invisible. For every heart that feels overlooked, every soul waiting quietly on life's staircase, and every person wondering whether anyone would stop for them, the answer is this: kindness notices, hope waits, and one sincere moment of human connection can become the beginning of a story beautiful enough to change not only one life but many more beyond it.